The arena was filled with roaring alien spectators, their deep voices vibrating through the metallic walls of the battle chamber. The Zeteri, a proud and warrior-like alien species, had gathered to witness another duel. Their champion, Vereshka, stood tall in the center, her dark armor gleaming under the artificial lights. She had never lost a fight. Her people believed humans were weak, nothing more than frail creatures who relied on their machines to survive. To prove it, Vereshka had issued an open challenge. Any human who dared to face her would be given the honor of a quick and painless defeat. Most of the human soldiers stationed on the planet hesitated. They had seen the Zeteri fight before. They knew that Vereshka was ruthless, her strength beyond anything the human could match. But then, from the crowd, one man stepped forward. His name was Daniel Carter. He wasn't the biggest or the strongest among his people, but his confidence was unwavering. He removed his helmet, revealing sharp, calculating eyes. "I'll fight you," he said simply, his voice calm. The Zeteri warriors burst into laughter. A human against Vereshka the Unbreakable. It was ridiculous. Even Vereshka smirked. "You're either very brave," she said, crossing her arms, "or very foolish." Daniel shrugged. "Maybe both." The match was set. The moment was historic. No human had ever fought a Zeteri warrior in single combat and survived. The air was electric with anticipation. As Daniel stepped into the arena, a high-ranking Zeteri official approached him. "You can still back out, human," he said, not unkindly. "Our warriors are born for battle. You are not." Daniel tightened his gloves and rolled his shoulders. "We'll see about that." On the other side, Vereshka watched him carefully. Unlike most humans, he wasn't shaking in fear. His body was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp. This one was different. The announcer's voice echoed across the arena. "Let the battle begin." Vereshka charged. Her massive frame moved with terrifying speed. She aimed for a quick, decisive strike, an open palm blow that would send Daniel flying across the arena. But he wasn't there. In the blink of an eye, Daniel had sidestepped, his movements fluid and precise. Vereshka's attack struck empty air. The crowd gasped. Vereshka narrowed her eyes. "Humph. Lucky." Daniel smirked. "Try again." Something about this human made her uneasy. He wasn't just fast. He was calm, analyzing her movements. This would not be as easy as she thought. For the first time in her warrior career, Vereshka felt a flicker of doubt. To be continued in Part 2. Vereshka's eyes blazed with determination. She wasn't used to this, being evaded by an opponent. The Zeteri warriors were all about strength and power, and she was one of the strongest among them. But this human, Daniel Carter, was fast. Too fast. She gritted her teeth and lunged again, faster this time. Her massive fist shot out, aiming directly for Daniel's chest. The audience held their breath, watching as the alien warrior's strike tore through the air. But Daniel wasn't there. At the last second, he ducked low, sliding under Vereshka's arm, and as he moved, he kicked her legs from under her. For a split second, Vereshka lost her balance, stumbling backward. The crowd gasped, and Daniel took a quick step back to regain his stance. For the first time, Vereshka felt something she hadn't in years: vulnerability. "You're good," she muttered under her breath, steadying herself. There was a glint of respect in her eyes, but she wasn't ready to give up. No, she was a Zeteri warrior, and she would win. This time, she decided to change her approach. Vereshka charged forward once more, but this time, she didn't use brute force. She feigned a punch to the left and then quickly swung her arm to the right. Daniel barely managed to block the blow with his forearms, the impact leaving a stinging sensation on his skin. He winced but quickly recovered, realizing that Vereshka wasn't playing around anymore. The crowd murmured in awe. Vereshka's fighting style had changed. She was adapting, and that made her even more dangerous. But Daniel didn't flinch. His eyes remained calm, his focus unshaken. This wasn't just about strength or speed. It was about outsmarting his opponent. The more Vereshka changed tactics, the more Daniel learned about her fighting style, about her weaknesses. She was fast, but she didn't anticipate the quick counterattacks Daniel had in mind. Daniel took a deep breath. Now was his moment. With one swift motion, he slid to the side and grabbed Vereshka's wrist, twisting it in a way that forced her to drop her guard. Her eyes widened in shock as Daniel pulled her in close and used her momentum to toss her off balance. For the second time in the fight, Vereshka was sent sprawling across the floor. For a moment, everything was quiet. Even the alien crowd was still. They had expected this to be a one-sided battle, but it was turning out to be something different. Vereshka quickly rolled to her feet, her eyes locked on Daniel. This human wasn't just quick, he was clever. Daniel smiled faintly, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. Still think I'm weak. Vereshka clenched her fists, fury rising. She had never been made to look foolish like this, and it angered her, but there was something else bubbling inside her. A feeling she hadn't expected. Respect. She had to win, not just for her people, but for herself. The fight was far from over. Vereshka's breathing had quickened. She had underestimated this human, and now her pride was on the line. She had been in countless battles, fought creatures bigger, stronger, and faster than humans, but never had she faced someone who made her question her every move. This human was different. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. The pain in her wrist still lingered from Daniel's swift counter, but she pushed it aside. No time for weakness. She charged at him again, but this time, she was more careful, more calculated. Her movements were slower, more deliberate. She wanted to trap him, to make him react to her, rather than the other way around. Daniel, too, adjusted his stance. He could feel the sweat trickling down his back, his body starting to feel the strain of the fight. But he wouldn't back down. Not now. He couldn't. As Vereshka closed in, Daniel quickly assessed the situation. She was strong. He had already learned it from their earlier exchanges. Her attacks were like a storm, relentless, powerful, but they lacked finesse. She was used to overwhelming her enemies, not outsmarting them. Daniel darted forward, making a move he hoped would surprise her. He feinted to the right, then quickly moved to the left. Vereshka fell for the trick, swinging her fist in the wrong direction. Daniel quickly sidestepped and grabbed her shoulder, spinning her around to face him. For a moment, Vereshka's balance wavered. She had been outsmarted again. With a swift motion, Daniel landed a sharp blow to her side. It wasn't enough to hurt her severely, but it was enough to shake her. She staggered back, feeling the impact. The crowd was silent, their eyes fixed on the two combatants. For the first time in the fight, it was clear that Daniel was holding his own. Vereshka's eyes flashed with something deeper than anger. Respect. No human had ever made her feel this way, not in a fight. Her species saw combat as a test of pure power, and here was a human proving that strength wasn't the only thing that mattered. She stepped back, breathing heavily. "You fight like no human I've ever seen," she said, her voice laced with both admiration and frustration. "You're not just quick. You're clever." Daniel gave her a small smile. "It's not about being clever. It's about knowing when to fight and when to wait." For a brief second, their eyes met. Vereshka realized he wasn't just trying to win the fight. He was trying to teach her something. Something no one else had ever dared to show her. But there was no time to think about it. This was a fight, and Vereshka wasn't about to let this human beat her. She clenched her fists, her body tensing for another round. She could feel the burn in her muscles, the growing fatigue from the relentless pace. But her pride, her honor, these things pushed her forward. She had to win, not just for her people, but to prove to herself that nothing could break her. Daniel took his stance once more. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving that humans had strength too. Strength in ways that the Jeteri would never understand. The battle wasn't over. Not yet. The arena was silent, and for a moment, it seemed like time had stopped. Daniel and Vereshka stood facing each other, both breathing heavily, their bodies aching from the fierce battle. Sweat dripped down Daniel's forehead, his legs sore from all the dodging and shifting. His arms were beginning to feel the weight of the fight, but he didn't dare show any signs of weakness. Vereshka, on the other hand, wasn't used to feeling so fatigued. The Hetairai were known for their endurance, their ability to fight for hours without tiring, but the human had managed to make her work harder than any opponent before. His unpredictability, his speed, he had taken her by surprise at every turn. It was frustrating, but there was a part of her that couldn't help but respect it. She wiped the sweat from her brow and took a step forward. Her eyes locked onto Daniel, and for the first time in the fight, there was no anger in her gaze, just something that almost resembled recognition. Daniel straightened his back and took a deep breath, wiping the blood from his lip. It wasn't much, but it was a reminder of the power Vereshka packed. Still, he was holding his own, and that's what mattered. He had a chance. This time, Vereshka was cautious. She didn't rush in with brute force. She studied his movements, waiting for him to make the first move. She knew he was trying to throw her off balance, to make her act without thinking. This time, she wouldn't fall for it. Daniel watched her carefully, his mind racing. He knew she was adapting, learning from each exchange. He had to be faster, smarter, or he wouldn't make it through. He couldn't outmatch her strength, but he could outwit her. He had to. He suddenly lunged, testing her reaction. He threw a quick punch toward her face, but it was a feint. He wasn't aiming to land the blow. As he predicted, Vereshka blocked it. But what she didn't expect was Daniel using his momentum to drop low and sweep her feet out from under her. The crowd gasped, and Vereshka stumbled, falling to the ground with a heavy thud. For a split second, her mind raced. She was on the floor. She had never been put down like this in a fight. But she wasn't defeated. Not yet. Before she could push herself up, Daniel was already on his feet, closing in. Vereshka, still on the ground, raised her leg to trip him, but he saw it coming and dodged just in time. He lunged forward, pinning her wrist to the ground, a move that would have defeated most opponents. Vereshka struggled, her strength enough to push against him, but she couldn't break his hold. For the first time in this fight, she found herself on the defensive. Daniel leaned down, looking her directly in the eyes. "Give up yet?" he asked, his voice calm, but with a hint of challenge. Vereshka's breath came in quick bursts. She was exhausted, her mind spinning. This human, this soldier, had done something no one else had ever done. He had pushed her to the edge. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting to win. For a moment, she considered his offer. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was time to surrender. But then something inside her clicked. No, she was a warrior, and warriors never gave up. Not like this. With a growl, Vereshka summoned all her strength and pushed Daniel off of her. She rolled to her feet, her body aching, but her spirit unbroken. "You're good, human," she said through clenched teeth. "But this fight isn't over yet." Daniel nodded, his own muscles burning. "I'm counting on it." The battle continued, and both fighters knew that the next move could decide everything. The crowd was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Vereshka and Daniel stood facing each other once more, their bodies battered from the fight. Yet their determination never wavered. Every part of Daniel ached. His arms, his legs, his chest. But he couldn't show it. He had learned that if he showed even the slightest weakness, Vereshka would take advantage of it. The same was true for her. Her every movement was calculated, but he could see the fatigue creeping into her eyes. Vereshka wiped the sweat from her brow, her grip tightening on her weapon. She had been in countless battles, but this one felt different. She had never faced an opponent like Daniel before. He wasn't just fast or strong. He was unpredictable. And for the first time in her career, That unpredictability was making her question everything she knew about combat. Daniel was no longer just trying to survive. He was winning. The alien warriors watching the fight from the stands could hardly believe their eyes. Some of them murmured in disbelief, while others exchanged looks of confusion. Was this really happening? A human, outmatching a Jeteri warrior. Vereshka took a deep breath, calming her racing heart. She couldn't let the doubt in her mind slow her down. The battle between Daniel and Vereshka had reached a point of no return. The fight had gone on long enough for both combatants to feel the exhaustion settling into their bodies, yet neither was willing to give in. A crowd remained quiet, watching with wide eyes as the two warriors continued to trade blows and counterattacks. Daniel's breath was ragged, his arms trembling, but his resolve never wavered. Vereshka, equally winded, narrowed her eyes with determination. "You're still standing," she said, her voice laced with admiration, but also a hint of frustration. "I've never met a human like you." She adjusted her stance, her fists ready for another strike. "You fight like no warrior I've ever faced." Daniel's face was set in a grim expression, his body screaming for rest. He wiped the blood from his lip, standing firm in front of her. "Maybe you've underestimated us," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady despite the fatigue. "I told you humans aren't just weak." Vereshka took a step back, scanning him carefully. He was tired. There was no denying that. But he hadn't given up. In fact, it was as if his energy had only grown stronger the longer they fought. Vereshka had been in countless battles, but this human was unlike any of her previous opponents. He wasn't just fighting to survive. He was fighting for something deeper, something she couldn't quite grasp. "You're holding back," she said suddenly, her eyes narrowing. "Why?" Daniel looked at her, surprised by the question. He hadn't been holding back, at least not intentionally. He was just doing what was necessary to win. But as he looked at Vereshka, standing there, looking both fierce and weary, he understood her question. She wasn't talking about physical strength. She was talking about respect. Humans, in her eyes, were a species to be beaten and controlled, not to be acknowledged as equals. But Daniel wasn't just fighting for his survival. He was fighting to show her that humans had something to offer beyond their perceived weaknesses. "I'm not holding back," he said slowly, his voice steady. "I'm just not fighting the way you think I should. Humans don't need to be as strong as you or as fast as you. We just need to think." He took a deep breath. "That's how we win." Vereshka stared at him, her mind racing. She had always relied on strength, on brute force. That's what the Jeteri valued, raw power. But here was this human, thinking his way through the battle, showing that intelligence and adaptability could be just as deadly as sheer strength. It was something she hadn't expected. The realization hit her hard. This was not just a fight. It was a lesson. And maybe, just maybe, this human had taught her something she never would have learned in a lifetime of combat. Her pride flared, but so did a strange sense of admiration. She wasn't used to admitting she was wrong. The Jeteri never admitted weakness, never backed down. But this human, Daniel, had broken down everything she had thought she knew about strength. Vereshka straightened, meeting his gaze. "You're right," she said, her voice quieter than before, the anger replaced by something else. "I didn't understand you. I thought humans were weak. But now," she paused, "now I see that you fight in a way no one else does." Daniel gave her a small smile. "Takes a strong warrior to admit that." For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was charged, not with anger or animosity, but with a mutual respect they had never expected to find in each other. Vereshka nodded slowly, then stepped back. "The fight's over," she said, her voice steady, but with an underlying respect that hadn't been there before. "You've earned my respect, human. And for the first time, I see what makes your people dangerous." Daniel exhaled, relieved, but still aware of the tension in the air. "I'm glad to hear that." And for the first time in this battle, Neither of them was sure who had truly won. But it didn't matter. They had both learned something about themselves and about each other. The arena was filled with a strange quiet, as if everyone was waiting for something monumental to happen. Vereshka and Daniel stood opposite each other, their eyes locked, both still catching their breath from the fierce combat they had just endured. They were no longer enemies in the way they had been at the start. Instead, something had shifted between them. Something deeper than just respect. It was understanding. Vereshka wiped the sweat from her brow, her muscles sore from the prolonged battle. She had never experienced such a fight before. It wasn't just about strength, speed, or skill. It was about adaptability, the ability to learn and adjust in the heat of battle. And Daniel had shown her that humans could do all of that, and more. "You know," Vereshka said, her voice quieter than before, "I thought I would crush you easily. I thought humans were nothing but weaklings, too soft for real combat." She paused, looking at Daniel in a way she hadn't before, with respect. "But you proved me wrong." Daniel, still catching his breath, managed a small smile. "I didn't come here to prove you wrong. I just wanted to show you that humans aren't as helpless as you think." Vereshka's eyes softened, and for a moment, she felt a wave of something she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just admiration for his skills. It was a recognition of the strength that humans had, a strength that came from their minds, their determination, and their refusal to give up. "You're not weak," Vereshka said, her voice steady now. "You're different. Your people have a strength that's not measured in muscle or power." Daniel nodded, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "It's about thinking when others just act. About seeing the bigger picture when people get lost in the fight." There was a long silence between them. The arena was still. Daniel had expected the Jateri to challenge him, to demand that the fight continue, but no one moved. Everyone was watching the interaction unfold between the human and their greatest warrior. Vereshka stepped closer, looking him in the eye. "The fight may be over today, but I'm not done with you. I need to know more about your people, how you think, how you fight. You're unlike anyone I've ever met." Daniel was surprised. He'd expected to be dismissed, to be seen as just another human who had somehow gotten lucky. But now Vereshka was asking for more. "What are you saying?" Daniel asked, his voice cautious. "I'm saying this," Vereshka replied. "You're not just a fighter. You're something more. I don't know what it is, but I want to see how far it goes. I want to learn from you, and I want to test you again, in the future, to see what else you have." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You want another round?" She nodded. "Not now, but soon. You've earned that much." Daniel thought about it for a moment, then grinned. "I think I can handle that." As Vereshka turned to walk away, she paused and looked over her shoulder at him. "I never thought I would say this to a human," she said, "but you've earned my respect. And one day I'll fight you again, not as an enemy, but as a warrior." Daniel nodded, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and excitement. "I'll be ready." The crowd that had been watching silently began to cheer. They were witnessing something historic, an unexpected bond forming between two warriors from completely different worlds. The fight had ended, but something else had begun. A challenge for the future. A challenge that would test them both in ways they hadn't even imagined. The cheering from the crowd still echoed in the arena, but Daniel's mind was far from the noise. His body was exhausted, his muscles aching from the battle, but his heart was pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the fight itself. He had done something he had never expected. He had earned the respect of one of the most powerful warriors in the galaxy. Vereshka stood at the edge of the arena, her posture straight, her expression one of quiet contemplation. She hadn't expected to feel this way after the fight. Usually, once an opponent was defeated, they were dismissed as either weak or irrelevant. But Daniel was different. He had pushed her to the limits, made her question everything she had believed about strength and combat. "I've never met a human like you," she said, her voice softer than before. She turned to face him again, her eyes locking with his. "You're unlike any warrior I've fought." Daniel smiled, though he was still breathing heavily. "I'm just a soldier, trying to do his job. But you taught me something too." Vereshka's brow furrowed slightly. "What's that?" "That it's not just about strength. It's about learning, adapting. You were so focused on overpowering me, but I was focused on outsmarting you." He wiped the sweat from his forehead, his face showing a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. "I never would have been able to do it without you pushing me. So, yeah, you've got something to teach me too." For a moment, Vereshka didn't speak. She looked at him as if seeing him for the first time, really seeing him. In the heat of battle, there hadn't been much time for reflection. But now, standing here, with the crowd growing quieter, she could feel the truth in his words. "You fought differently than any human I've ever heard of," she said slowly, her voice still laced with respect. "It's not just your skills or your strength, Daniel Carter. You have a spirit I've never seen before. You fight with a purpose." Daniel nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "I fight because I have to, and because I believe in what I'm fighting for. But I've learned from you today. You don't just fight with power, you fight with purpose too." She stepped closer to him, her stance still strong, but the tension between them different now. There was no longer the animosity that had started this battle. There was respect. "I don't know what will happen next," she said quietly, "but I do know this. If we meet again in combat, it will be different. It won't be about defeating each other. It will be about testing our limits and seeing who we truly are as warriors." Daniel's chest rose and fell with deep breaths. He hadn't expected this moment to come, a promise for a future not of enemies, but of mutual growth. "I'll be ready when the time comes," he said, his voice steady, but full of conviction, "and I'll look forward to that fight." Vereshka smiled, a rare and genuine smile that softened her usually hardened features. "I'll hold you to that." She turned to leave, but then paused, looking back at him. "You're a warrior, Daniel. Maybe one day you'll even be my equal." Daniel stood there, watching her walk away, a feeling of accomplishment settling in his chest. He had come to this arena expecting nothing more than a fight for survival, but what he had gained was far more valuable: a warrior's respect and a promise for something greater. As the crowd began to cheer again, Daniel looked around the arena. Today, he hadn't just won a battle, he had earned something even more important: the understanding that sometimes the most unexpected alliances are the ones that teach us the most. And as he walked off the arena floor, he knew that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The days following the battle between Daniel and Vereshka passed quickly, but the memory of that fight lingered in the minds of both humans and Jateri alike. The arena where they had clashed stood silent, the echoes of their confrontation still hanging in the air. Though the fight was over, the impact of their encounter was far from finished. Daniel spent most of his time in the barracks, recovering from the intense battle. His muscles were sore, his body bruised, but it wasn't the physical pain that lingered. It was the challenge of the fight, the realization that he had stood toe-to-toe with one of the fiercest warriors in the galaxy and had earned her respect. He couldn't shake the feeling that Vereshka had been more than just an opponent. She had been a test, a way for him to prove not only to her, but to himself that humans had the strength to stand on equal ground with the most powerful species in the universe. As he sat in his quarters, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He stood quickly, surprised by the unexpected visitor. When he opened it, he found himself face to face with a familiar, imposing figure. "Vereshka." "Vereshka," Daniel said, his voice low. "What are you doing here?" "I've come to speak with you," she replied, her voice steady, but carrying a hint of something more. "Purpose." Daniel stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. He had expected their meeting to be one of those rare, brief encounters, the kind where warriors acknowledge each other's skill and move on. But this was different. Something had shifted between them that couldn't be ignored. "I've been thinking," Vereshka continued as she stood in the center of the room, her eyes focused and intense. About what you said before, about testing our limits, pushing beyond what we think we know. You were right. That fight, it was more than just a contest of strength. It was about understanding. It was about finding out who we are. Daniel nodded, his curiosity piqued. You want another fight? He asked, half joking, but also serious. No, Vereshka said firmly. Not now. But soon, perhaps. What I want is for us to train together, to push each other to become better. You were right when you said humans have a different kind of strength. I want to learn more about that strength, and I think you could learn something from me as well. Daniel blinked, surprised. You want to train with me? He paused for a moment, trying to take it in. That's unexpected. She looked at him with a steady gaze, her expression softening slightly. I spent my life believing that the strongest warriors are those who rely on their physical strength, their speed. But after fighting you, I know that there's more to being a warrior. It's about thinking, adapting, learning. You've shown me that, and I want to see how far that can take me. Daniel felt a mix of surprise and pride. The offer was unexpected, but it made sense. Both of them had learned something valuable in the fight. They were no longer just combatants. They were partners, pushing each other to grow stronger in ways that they couldn't have imagined alone. I'm in, Daniel said with a grin, feeling a surge of excitement. I'll train with you, and who knows, maybe we'll learn something neither of us expected. Vereshka nodded, a rare smile crossing her face. I look forward to it. As she turned to leave, Daniel watched her, a sense of anticipation building within him. This wasn't just about the fight anymore. It was about growth, not just for themselves, but for their people. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. A warrior's promise had been made, and it was a promise that neither of them would break. Together, they would test their limits, push each other to become better, and maybe, just maybe, show the galaxy what humans and Jeteri could achieve when they worked side by side. Weeks passed since Daniel and Vereshka had made their pact to train together. The days following their agreement were filled with rigorous preparation, not only physically but mentally as well. Every training session was different from what either of them had experienced before. They no longer viewed each other as opponents in the traditional sense, but as partners, challenging and supporting one another in ways they hadn't expected. Vereshka had always believed that strength came from the body, from brute force and speed. But under Daniel's guidance, she began to understand that real power came from the mind. The ability to adapt, to think ahead, to outsmart an opponent rather than just overpower them. Daniel, too, found himself learning from her. He had never seen combat through the eyes of someone who had been raised to fight as a warrior since birth. Vereshka's speed, her precision, her unmatched ability to predict moves. It was all part of the warrior mindset. It was a mindset that Daniel knew he could use to become an even better fighter. One evening, after a particularly intense training session, the two of them sat on the edge of the training field, their bodies exhausted but their minds alert. The sunset painted the sky with hues of orange and purple as they sat in silence, their thoughts consumed by the day's lessons. You know, Vereshka said, breaking the quiet, I never thought I would learn anything from a human, much less be grateful for it. She glanced at Daniel, a small smile tugging at her lips. You've opened my eyes to a new way of thinking. I thought the way I fought was the only way to fight, but now I know it's just one way. Daniel chuckled, wiping the sweat from his brow. I guess that's the thing about training with someone else. You learn things you never thought about. I've learned a lot from you too. Vereshka raised an eyebrow. Like what? Like how to trust my instincts more, how to read my opponent, Daniel replied, his eyes focused on the horizon, and how to push my limits. You've got a fire in you I didn't expect. I've learned that there's always more to discover about what we're capable of. For a moment, Vereshka didn't respond. She simply stared at the setting sun, reflecting on the words. She had spent so many years focused on being the best, the strongest, that she had never thought to challenge the way she approached combat. She had always believed that her path was the only path, but now Daniel had shown her that there were many roads to victory. "I've never met anyone like you," she said quietly, the admiration clear in her voice. "Maybe humans aren't as weak as I once thought." Daniel smiled, his eyes meeting hers. "Maybe you Jeteri aren't as invincible as you thought either." The two shared a quiet laugh, the bond between them growing stronger with each passing day. What had started as a brutal fight had transformed into something much more, a partnership, a friendship, and a deep respect that neither of them could have predicted. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they both knew that the future was full of unknowns, but one thing was certain: their journey together had only just begun. The challenges they had faced and would continue to face had forged them into something stronger, warriors not just for their people, but for each other. They would carry the lessons they had learned from each other and pass them on, ensuring that what they had created would last far beyond their time. Daniel and Vereshka stood up, their bodies sore but their spirits high. They knew that their legacy was just beginning, and that together they could face anything the future had in store.